The lawyer told me I was making the biggest mistake of my life. I remember the way her pen stopped moving above the page, the way she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I just smiled and signed everything over to my husband. The house in Oakville, the cottage on Georgian Bay, the savings, all of it. What none of them understood, not her, not him, not his smug lawyer in his press suit, was that I had already won. They just hadn't realized it yet. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Please give this video a like, stay with me until the end, and tell me in the comments which city you're listening from. I love seeing how far my little story travels. For 38 years, I thought I knew the man I married. Jeffrey and I built everything from the ground up. We started with nothing but a leased garage on the edge of Hamilton and a secondhand pickup truck that smelled permanently of motor oil. I was 66 years old, and I genuinely believed we'd spend whatever time we had left sitting on the dock at the cottage, watching the loons, growing old the way we'd always promised each other we would. I was a fool, but not the kind of fool he thought I was. It started so small I almost talked myself out of noticing. Jeffrey began staying late at the showroom. We'd grown the business into a proper dealership by then. 2 locations, a service center, the whole thing. He'd come home and there'd be a smell on his jacket, something light and floral, expensive. When I asked, he'd laugh and say one of the salesgirls must have spilled her perfume reaching past him for a brochure. His phone, which used to sit face up on the kitchen counter while we did the crossword, now went everywhere with him. Into the bathroom, into the garage. Face down, always, with a passcode he changed when I happened to glance over one morning. "Jeffrey," I said one evening, while the snow came down soft and steady outside the window, "is there someone else?" He didn't even look up from his plate. "Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. I'm 68. What would I want with all that nonsense? And God help me, I wanted to believe him. I made myself believe him for almost 4 months, until the bank statements. We'd always kept our personal accounts joint, even after the business money got complicated, and one afternoon I sat at the kitchen table going through them the way I did every quarter. Dinners at restaurants in Yorkville I'd never set foot in. A weekend at a resort in Muskoka the same week he told me he was at a dealers conference in Winnipeg, a charge from a jewelry shop on Bloor Street for $1,100. I sat there with my reading glasses sliding down my nose, and I added it up and added it up again, because surely I was wrong. Thousands of dollars, tens of thousands, stretching back over a year. The thing that finally broke me wasn't the money. It was a card. I was taking his Goodwill coat to the cleaners before the holidays, the camel one I'd bought him for our 30th, and I checked the inside pocket the way you do, and there it was, a little folded card with a sprig of holly on the front. Inside, in handwriting that was young and round and nothing like mine, "Jeff, you've made me feel 20 again. I can't wait to start our real life. All my love, your Renee." I stood in the front hall of the house we'd raised our children in, and I read it maybe 6 times, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something I could survive. Renee. She had a name. She had a name. She had handwriting. She was waiting for a real life with my husband. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not then. I put the card in my purse, I drove to the cleaners, I picked up the milk, and I made his dinner. That night, after he'd had his second glass of wine, I set the card down on the table next to his plate, holly side up. His face went through 3 things in about 2 seconds. White, then red, then something cold and flat that I'd never once seen in 38 years. And it scared me more than rage would have. "I want a divorce," he said. Just like that, as if he'd been rehearsing it in the truck on the way home for weeks. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. I think it's best we keep this civil." "Civil?" I repeated. The word came out of me strange and small. "I'll be fair," he said, and then he ruined it. "The business is in my name, Eleanor. The properties are in my name. I made sure of that years ago on the advice of my accountant. You'll receive what I decide is reasonable, and I'd strongly suggest you take it, because if you fight me, you'll spend everything you have on lawyers, and you'll still lose. I want you to understand something. I worked in that dealership for 22 years. I did the books. I handled the financing paperwork, the manufacturer rebates, the payroll for the mechanics. When Jeffrey wanted to expand to the second location, it was me who sat up nights building the projections the bank needed to approve the loan. I retired at 58 only because he told me sweetly that I'd earned my rest and that the new office manager could handle it. I'd believed that was love. I built that business beside you, I said. He stood and he straightened his tie and he looked at me the way you'd look at a piece of furniture you were planning to put out at the curb. Good luck proving that to a judge, he said. There's no record you were ever paid a cent for most of it. He took his keys off the hook. My lawyer will be in touch. Get yourself one too. You'll want one. Then he walked out into the snow, and he didn't come back. He moved into a condo downtown that I later learned he'd already furnished. He'd been planning his exit while I was still ironing his shirts. 3 weeks later, I sat across a desk from a lawyer my daughter had found for me, a kind, careful woman named Priya, who went through Jeffrey's proposed settlement with her jaw getting tighter by the page. "Mrs. Whitfield," she finally said, taking off her glasses, "I have to be honest with you. This is insulting. He's offering you $90,000 and the contents of the house. The dealership group is worth, conservatively, $4 million. The Oakville house alone is worth 1.3. The cottage is another 600,000. What are my chances, I asked, if we fight? She hesitated for a long time. I've learned that when a lawyer hesitates, you're in trouble. Difficult, she admitted. He's been very deliberate. The corporation is solely in his name. The properties are titled to him alone. Family law in Ontario should protect you. The matrimonial home. Equalization of net family property. All of it. But he can drag this out for years. He has the cash flow to bury you in legal fees. And if there's no documentation of your role in the business, proving your contribution gets expensive and uncertain. She looked at me with real sympathy. I won't lie to you. He set this up to win. I went home that night to the house that wasn't going to be mine much longer, and I sat in the dark, and I let myself fall apart for exactly 1 hour. I cried until my chest ached. And then, somewhere around midnight, the crying stopped, and something colder and clearer took its place. He thought I was the soft one. He thought the office manager part of me had retired along with the rest. But I'm the woman who reconciled that company's books for 22 years, who never once let an invoice go unfiled, who could tell you to the dollar what we spent on shop rags in 1994. Jeffrey used to roll his eyes at me. Eleanor and her filing cabinets, he'd say at dinner parties. She keeps every receipt like it's evidence. He meant it as a joke. He had no idea. I had taken 3 things from the house when I first realized which way the wind was blowing: my mother's ring, the photo albums, and a banker's box of old files I'd quietly carried out to my car one afternoon while he was at the showroom, because some instinct older than reason told me to. I spread it all out on the floor of the little apartment I'd rented near my daughter's place in Burlington. A 1-bedroom with a view of a parking lot and walls so thin I could hear my neighbor's kettle. I was 66 years old and starting over in a rental, and instead of despairing, I made myself a pot of tea and I started going through that box one document at a time, the way I'd learned to do decades ago. When everything feels like too much, you stop feeling and you start sorting. Facts, dates, names. I found things Jeffrey had forgotten existed. In the early years, before the accountant ever got his hands on us, we'd done everything together and we put both our names on everything. There were letters to suppliers from 1987, signed Jeffrey and Eleanor Whitfield, co-proprietors. There was a personal loan agreement from 1991, where the bank had required us both to sign as joint owners of the business to secure financing for the second bay. There were the original incorporation papers from 1989 when we first turned the garage into a real company. And there, in faded dot matrix print, were two directors listed: Jeffrey R. Whitfield, Eleanor M. Whitfield, each holding 50% of the shares. I sat back on the cheap beige carpet and I held those incorporation papers in my hands and I started to laugh, quietly in a way that probably would have worried my daughter if she'd seen it. He had restructured the company in 2003. I remembered it now, vaguely, the way you remember signing something a spouse pushes across the kitchen table while telling you it's just a tax thing, just a formality, don't worry your head about it. He'd told me it was to protect us from liability. What he'd actually done, I now understood, was transfer the shares into a holding company that he controlled, and somewhere in that paperwork I'd trusted him enough not to read carefully. He'd reduced me to nothing. But the original company had never been properly dissolved. And the share transfer? If I was reading these documents the way my old bookkeeper's brain insisted on reading them, had been done without the independent legal advice a transaction like that between spouses really ought to have. He'd cut corners to save money, the way he always did. Jeffrey was cheap in exactly the places that would one day cost him everything. The next morning I did not call Priya. She's a good woman, but she'd watched me weep in her office and she thought of me as a victim, and I needed someone who would look at this box and see a weapon. My son-in-law worked in commercial real estate and he'd mentioned, once, at a barbecue, a lawyer who'd handle the brutal partnership dispute for his firm. Margaret Donnelly. He said she was expensive and that opposing counsel were afraid of her. That was exactly the woman I wanted. I called her office and a polished voice told me Ms. Donnelly was booked solid for 6 weeks. Please tell her, I said, that I have original 1989 incorporation documents proving I'm a 50% shareholder of a $4 million company that my husband claims he built alone. I have evidence he's been moving money, and I have a settlement offer I'm being pressured to sign before he finds out I've found any of this. There was a pause on the line. Can you come in at 3? Margaret Donnelly was perhaps 60 herself, with steel-gray hair cut blunt at the jaw and the kind of stillness that makes you straighten your spine. She read through my box for nearly an hour without saying a word. I sat there listening to the radiator tick. Finally, she set down the incorporation papers, folded her hands, and looked at me. Mrs. Whitfield, has your husband filed anything with the court yet? No. His lawyer says they're still preparing the paperwork. And you haven't signed his settlement? Not yet. They're expecting me to sign it next week. Something moved at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. Then I'm going to tell you what I would never tell most clients. I want you to sign it. I thought I'd misheard her. I want you to walk in there next week, she said, leaning forward. And I want you to give your husband every single thing he's asking for. The business, the houses, all of it. I want you to do it without a fuss. I want him relaxed. I want his lawyer relaxed. I want them so certain they've won that they stop being careful. She tapped the incorporation papers. Because this changes everything, and the moment they understand that, they will start hiding things faster than we can find them. But if they believe it's over, they'll get sloppy. And we will have already filed our application to set the whole thing aside on the grounds that you signed under duress, without proper financial disclosure, and without knowing the true value of assets that were partly yours to begin with. You want me to give him everything, I said slowly, so that I can take everything. I want you to let him think he's holding all the cards, she said, while I deal you a better hand under the table. The properties are matrimonial. The business is half yours on paper from 1989. And I have a very strong feeling that if we get a forensic accountant into those corporate books, your husband is going to wish he'd never met me. So that is what I did. The following Thursday, I sat in a glass conference room downtown, and I signed away 38 years of my life with a steady hand and a small, pleasant smile. and I watched Jeffrey's lawyer slide the pages toward me one after another. And I watched Jeffrey himself slouch back in his chair, looking bored. The way you look when you're certain the hard part is over. He didn't even meet my eyes. He was already somewhere else, already at brunch with Renee, already free. "You're being very sensible, Eleanor," he said, almost kindly, when it was done. "I'm glad we could do this without it getting ugly." "So am I said, and I meant it more than he could possibly know. What I didn't tell him was that Margaret Donnelly's office had filed our application that same morning, an hour before our meeting, while he was getting his car detailed for his new life. The forensic accountant was a quiet young woman named Sandra, who wore the same gray cardigan to every meeting and had the most extraordinary eye for a lie hidden in a spreadsheet. It took her 11 weeks to go through the dealership group's records, the ones our lawyers compelled Jeffrey to produce, and what she found turned my stomach even though I'd half expected it. Jeffrey had been bleeding the business for nearly 2 years. There were payments to a numbered company that, when Sandra peeled back the layers, turned out to be controlled by Renee's brother. There was a consulting fee of $40,000 a quarter to a marketing firm that, as far as anyone could tell, had never produced a single advertisement. There was a company credit card with charges for a downtown condo's furnishings, for jewelry, for a trip to Italy I certainly never took. He'd been moving marital money out the back door, getting ready to start over with a clean slate and a young girlfriend, leaving me with $90,000 in the throw pillows. But it was worse than an affair and a few hidden dollars. When Sandra cross-referenced the corporate filings against what Jeffrey had reported, the discrepancies were large enough that she stopped, the day she found it, and said to me very gently, "Mrs. Repeater Whitfield, some of this is going to be of interest to the Canada Revenue Agency, whether we report it or not. I have a professional obligation here. You should be prepared." I told her to do whatever the law required. I was done protecting that man. The reckoning didn't happen all at once. These things never do, no matter what the movies tell you. It happened over 14 months of motions and disclosures and a deposition, where I watched Jeffrey sweat through his good shirt as Margaret Donnelly walked him, line by line, through the 1989 incorporation papers with both our names on them, asking in her calm, flat voice whether he recalled signing them, whether that was his signature, whether he disputed that I had been a founding director and equal shareholder. He did not have good answers. There are no good answers to the truth. The day his own lawyer asked for a private meeting with Margaret, I knew it was finished. They didn't want this in front of a judge. They didn't want the CRA matter, which by then had grown teeth of its own, dragged through open court alongside the embezzlement and the numbered company and Renee's brother. They wanted a deal, and they wanted it quietly. I won't pretend the settlement was simple, but here's what it came to in the end. The original signing, the one I'd done with a smile, was set aside completely, exactly as Margaret had planned. My 50% of the company was recognized. The matrimonial home and the cottage were brought into equalization the way Ontario law always intended them to be, and the money Jeffrey had hidden was added back into the pot and counted against his share, dollar for dollar. After legal fees and accountants and the long bite of taxes, I walked away with a little over $2.1 million. More money than this farmer's daughter from outside Guelph ever imagined holding in her life. I bought a small house in Burlington, paid for outright, with a maple tree in the front yard that turns the color of fire every October. I set up education funds for both my grandchildren, so they'll never start their adult lives drowning the way so many young people do now. I gave $100,000 to a women's shelter in Hamilton, the same city where Jeffrey and I had started, with that oily garage and that second-hand truck, because it felt right that some good should come out of that ground. The rest I put with a sensible advisor who keeps me in GICs and dividend stocks and tells me every quarter that I will never have to worry about money again. And then I did something I didn't expect. I started volunteering at a legal clinic downtown. the kind that helps people who can't afford a Margaret Donnelly. I sit with women, mostly women my age, who come in shaking the way I once shook, certain they've lost everything, certain it's too late. I tell them about my box of files. I tell them to keep their records. I tell them that the law is more on their side than fear lets them believe. My daughter came over last Sunday with the kids. While she was putting the kettle on, she mentioned that she'd heard from her father. "How is he?" I asked, and I was a little surprised to find I could ask it without the old knot in my chest. She made a face. "Not good, Mom. The CRA thing went badly. He owes back taxes and penalties a lot. His partners, the silent investors he brought in to expand, they forced him out of the dealership group completely once all of this came to light. Nobody wanted their name next to his." "And Renee?" I asked. I'll admit I was curious. My son-in-law looked up from the floor where he was building something out of blocks with my granddaughter. "Gone," he said. "Months ago. Turns out the romance cooled off pretty quick once the money dried up." I should have felt triumphant, I suppose. Mostly what I felt was a quiet, distant sadness. 38 years, 2 children, a whole life, and he'd traded it for a girl who left the moment his accounts ran dry. He's renting a 1-bedroom in Mississauga now, I'm told, doing some kind of part-time consulting for a fleet leasing company, making a fraction of what he used to. Starting over at 70 in a thin-walled apartment, the way he tried to make me start over. I didn't wish it on him. The world did that on its own. The doorbell rang while we were finishing our tea, and it was my neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Doreen who'd moved in down the street the same month I did. She'd brought over a tortilla, still warm because she'd made 2, and figured I could use 1. "I won't keep you," she said. "I just wanted to ask if you'd come to the book club Thursday. We're reading something Canadian for once, the new E.C. Edwin. Have you read her?" "I haven't," I said. "I'd love to come." After everyone had gone and the dishes were done, I went out and sat on my back step in the cool of the evening. The maple was just beginning to turn. Somewhere a few yards over, kids were shrieking on a trampoline, and the sound carried in that way it does on a still Ontario night. My phone buzzed. It was Margaret Donnelly, of all people, who'd become something close to a friend over those 14 months. "Eleanor," she said, "thought you'd want to know. His personal bankruptcy was discharged today. It's well and truly over now. Every last piece of it." I sat with that for a moment. "How do you feel?" she asked, the way she had a habit of doing. I was out at my own yard, my own tree, the lights coming on in my own kitchen behind me. "Free," I said. "Not because he's lost everything. I don't take any joy in that, I really don't. Just because it's finished, and I'm still standing, and this life is mine." "You didn't just win in court," Margaret said. "You rebuilt. He never could. There's a difference, and it's everything." We said goodnight, and I stayed out there until the light was nearly gone. I thought about the girl from Guelph who'd married a charming young man with grease under his fingernails and a dream about cars, and how she'd given him 38 years and very nearly let him take the last thing she had, which wasn't the house or the business or the money at all. It was the knowing deep down that she had built something real and that it had mattered. He tried to take my future. He nearly convinced me I'd already lost it. Instead, I sat on my own back step in a house no one could ever take from me, in the country I'd lived in my whole life, and I watched the dusk come down soft and blue over a yard that was mine, all mine, and I understood that I was richer than I had ever been, in every way that a person can be. If you'd been in my shoes, would you have signed those papers? Would you have fought, or would you have walked away? Tell me in the comments. And if any part of my story found you tonight, please subscribe and stay a while, because there's a kind of strength that comes from knowing we're not alone in these things. Thank you for sitting with me. And please remember, no matter how old you are or how far down it feels you've been pushed, it is never, ever too late to stand up and claim what's yours. The strange thing is that none of it would have happened the way it did if Jeffrey hadn't been so sure of himself. He'd spent years convincing me my contribution didn't count, and he'd believed his own story so completely that he never once imagined I might have kept the receipts. That was his undoing, really, not my cleverness. His certainty. A man who lies long enough starts to mistake the lie for the ground he's standing on, and then one day the ground gives way, and he's genuinely shocked to be falling. I've thought about that a great deal since. The dishonesty wasn't just the affair, or even the money he funneled out the back door to Renee's brother. It was the smaller thing underneath all of it, the quiet decision to treat the person who'd stood beside him for 38 years as someone he could discard without consequence. Life has a way of collecting on debts like that, slowly, and then all at once. What saved me wasn't luck. I want to be clear about that, especially for anyone listening who feels too old or too tired to fight. I kept records for 22 years not because I was clever, but because I refused to be careless with the truth of my own work. That habit, plain and unglamorous, is what gave Margaret something to fight with. And when the moment came, the smartest thing I ever did was to set my pride aside, to walk into that conference room and sign away everything with a smile, because I understood that looking like I'd lost was the only way to actually win. There's a kind of wisdom that has nothing to do with being educated. It's just paying attention, thinking 2 moves ahead, and being honest with yourself about what's really happening, even when it breaks your heart. But none of the knowing would have mattered without the part that came after the crying stopped. I gave myself 1 hour on the floor of that little rental to fall apart, and then I got up. I made the tea. I opened the box. I called the lawyer who frightened people instead of the one who pitied me. Starting over at 66 in a thin-walled apartment with a parking lot for a view takes a stubbornness that I didn't know I had until I needed it. I think we all carry more of that than we believe. We just don't get to find out until everything we counted on is taken away. So if you take anything from my story, let it be this: do the right thing, even quietly, even when no one's watching, because integrity is the only thing they truly can't take from you. Keep your eyes open and your records kept, because clear thinking will save you when nothing else can. And when life knocks you flat, at an age when you thought the fighting was behind you, get up anyway. I sat on my own back step that evening, watching the maple turn, and I understood that the woman from Guelph hadn't lost a thing worth keeping. She'd finally found out exactly who she was.